Well, hi everyone. Welcome back to Club Grubbery, part two of an enthralling interview that we're doing with David Hughes, an academic from the UK who is devoting his entire life to international relations. He's had an incredible academic career looking at all the issues that we're facing as a global society. We are effectively in World War III. There is no doubt about that. And our guest, David Hughes, has been illuminating us with very basic stuff, but it's material that a lot of you have been struggling to comprehend. I know 5 or 10 years ago you could have knocked me over with a feather if I heard this, but the last show we did with David, part one, just generated this part two. So we thank you for hanging around and being back on the program, David.
My pleasure.
We've only just touched on your first book, COVID-19: Psychological Operations and the War for Technocracy. Your second book, Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State. Of course, they're intertwined, but this is one that I, for one, really want you to unpack with us because this is super intriguing and they're all linked, aren't they?
They are, and the two books really should be read together and treated as part of a single attempt to make sense of the bigger picture of what has been happening since 2020. And one of the things that I try to do with the Wall Street book is to unpack the historical origins of the crisis that confronted us. And I was very struck, particularly in 2021 when I heard certain commentators, for example, the Holocaust survivor Vera Sharav, drawing parallels with Nazi Germany. And people like her were jumped on at the time and were told, you can't say that. This is nothing like that. It's offensive to draw those parallels. And I thought to myself, well, you know, I I finished that German studies PhD in 2006, and to be honest, I didn't think I'd ever really need it again. But I do have 2 degrees in in modern languages from Oxford University, an undergraduate and a master's degree, and I do have this PhD in German studies. And my area of specialization was 20th century German history, which cannot be understood without a decent knowledge of the Nazi past. So I do know a few things about the Nazi past.
Yeah.
And to me, what I'm seeing is not hyperbole. It's not overblown. It's not offensive. There is clear evidence, in my opinion, that there are these continuities. And so, somewhat reluctantly, I went back into my German studies mode and started dredging up all of this information about the Nazi past. And I tried to synthesize it for a wider audience in a clear and easy to understand way. And so the way the book works is that I begin by drawing a series of, I think, 14 different areas of continuity between what took place in 1930s Nazi Germany and the political economy of the West since 2020. And then having established that there are these many areas of similarity, also areas of discontinuity as well. I recognize those. I'm not trying to say it's a direct repeat or anything like that. But having established that fundamental premise, the middle chapters of the book are then spent explaining how we got from the 1930s to 2020 and how various different actors have found their way through that kind of historical process. And the final part of the book, one of the end chapters, is called Where It Leads, which is to say, given that there appears to be a deliberate attempt underway now to collapse liberal democracy and institute a novel form of totalitarianism, technocracy, given we know where 1930s Nazi Germany ultimately led, because all of the worst horrors of that regime didn't really begin until 1941 with the war of extermination in the East, the death camps, the Holocaust, and so on. Given we know where it all went and we can see the similar historical trajectories playing out today, here's what we can expect to happen if this global technocratic coup is not put down. So that is the structure of the book in a nutshell. It is designed to send a red flag, a warning signal, as clearly and as loudly as possible to everyone to sit up and pay attention because we are in deep trouble if this is not stopped.
Johnny.
Mm. Where do you think the next levers will be pulled here? Do you think that there'll be a shutdown of the financial system? What do you think is the next thing to play out?
I don't have a crystal ball, um, but a couple of things that they've not tried yet, where there have been kind of hints, if you like. First of all, water. In a World Economic Forum event, I think at the end of 2022, there was a UCL professor, Maria Mazzucato, I think her name was. And I mean, they're tremendously frank and open at their own events. And she was quite brazen. She said, well, look, everybody knows that the whole climate change thing, it's not really flying. Okay. We know that, not enough people took the shots, not as many as we would have liked. So, what are we going to do next? Well, the key thing, right, is water. Even a child knows how important water is. So, I mean, it's incredible how these people talk. But straight away, I thought, well, one thing that they've not done yet is to weaponize water. So there could be, manufactured water shortages, which again, everybody has to have clean water. So were something like that to happen, that would be a lever of enormous control. The other thing is a paper by, now what was it? Was it one of the US Naval Defense Intelligence officers that I read at the end of 2023, which had one of these kind of hypothetical scenarios because they love their scenario planning. And the scenario related to, I think it was Okinawa in Japan. And what happened was the internet went out. And so what would the response be? There'd be kind of social chaos and so on. How would such a thing be dealt with? Of course, everything now is run through the internet. So can you imagine if the internet itself went down for a period of time? And I'm sure this is possible at the flick of a switch for whoever is in control.
Mm.
Now, again, that could be the kind of thing which could be used to generate short-term chaos, really frighten people. And then when the internet comes back on, it will be with conditions that you can only access the internet through biometric identification, for example. And so you are 100% linked onto the control grid at that point. And I don't know about you in Australia, but here in the UK, for many years now, and again, I think I note this in my Omnivore report, there are every few weeks, there's a new story in the news. And of course, the news isn't an objective reflection of what's happening in the world, it's programming. So every few weeks in the UK, there's a story about how some major corporation or others or other, sometimes it's the really big ones like Facebook or Instagram. There's been some kind of crisis and it went down for a few hours. And I think the effect is to be drip feeding this sense in the population that, my goodness, these technologies are a bit unstable, aren't they? They're not quite trustworthy enough. And even the big companies, they go down and the big banks go out of action every now and again. So what we really need is an ultra secure system, right? And I'm sure they have that ready and waiting in the wings. I'm sure the military developed it a long time ago. And it's something, everybody is registered biometrically. That there can't be any risk of anything going wrong. Of course, all of this business of the Online Safety Act and everything, the idea, that people are doing harm, that's their key word, harm online, by free speech is now rebranded as harm, essentially. If you say the wrong things, if you have the certain dissident viewpoints, that allegedly is harmful. Well, how do you combat that? It's the digital ID again, isn't it? It's not being able to get online without some form of biometric identification. So something like that also, I think, could be in the works, but it's pure speculation. There are other people who think that they might try pulling what Bill Gates called the next pandemic, or what Joe Biden called the second pandemic. as part of what Ursula von der Leyen calls the era of pandemics. I mean, the nonsense, the scientific illiterate nonsense that these people come out with. It could be that the war on terror paradigm and terrorist attacks. I think that's probably run its day now. Could there be another financial crisis on the 2007 2008 model? Always possible. There are always people saying that, oh my God, it's topped. The end is nigh, and meanwhile the stock market continues to climb. So who knows?
Well, it certainly seems like they're locking the children out of, or 16-year-olds out of the internet here in Australia with the
Yes.
censorship of social media. That's obviously a trial run, and I imagine the global leaders are watching on with a lot of interest. But yeah, another thing that is a big factor here in Australia is fuel, because I think is it 2 weeks, Hoodie, at any one time. I don't think there's any more fuel.
Well, I
Um,
think we've got 11 days of diesel, and all
yeah.
our reserves, strategic reserves, are held in the US. So I don't know how we get them from there to here. But the other thing is, a distributor that brings fuel to the farm that I live on said that Brisbane, a major centre, was down to 2 days of fuel, and they're queuing up for 4 hours to get fuel into tankers to distribute to service stations around the country. And the refineries are saying that they're desperately afraid of the shortages of fuel that seem to be becoming more and more prevalent.
Mm.
I've had a chat with some intelligence analysts who approached me one day who said that they envisage in Australia in the very near future that diesel will get to $15 a litre. What's that, about £7 a litre? And that if China wants to win a war with Australia, they only have to blockade our fuel supplies and we're done. So, all that sort of stuff really, people are aware of it, but they're sort of sticking their heads in the sand because they don't really want to think about it. But getting back to the title of your book, Wall Street, the Nazis, and the Crimes of the Deep State, a lot of people in the know now can see clearly that Wall Street is a foundational hub for geopolitical Zionism and has been for a long, long time. That's where all the action seems to happen in Wall Street. We also know, if we study our history, that Wall Street funded a lot of Nazi operations during World War II, including the Holocaust. We understand that to be true. That's historical fact. Um, but linking Wall Street, the Zionists, the Nazis, and the crimes against the deep state, um, take us on a journey through that. How did you come up with that title, and what is the driving force behind it?
Wow, that's a big question. So I guess the first thing, the Wall Street angle, is I was interested in trying to work out who is behind this. How is this all working? Because again, it's not by accident the parallels that I've described between now and then. So the argument I make in the book is that it can only be understood through class relations, and that what happened in Nazi Germany was very much a response to not only the terms of the Versailles Treaty, but also the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression that ensued. And I mean, transnationally, there were states had to respond to this massive crisis of capitalism. And in the case of Nazi Germany, the response was totalitarian. Russia already had Stalinism, of course. But what's really fascinating is that this wasn't just a kind of phenomena that happened just by itself within Germany. The rise of Hitler was only possible through funding by powerful Wall Street interests. And in the 1930s, the building of the Nazi war machine was only enabled again by these very powerful interests. So, for example, the Rockefeller Standard Oil Company providing a lot of the fuel and so on, the kind of gas and oil products that were necessary for this, as well as for example, Ford helping to provide the components to manufacture vehicles. And once this got into World War II, the sustaining of that war was only possible with, again, continued funding from these companies. And what was so scandalous about it was that Standard Oil, for example, was withholding oil from the United States while secretly sending oil to Nazi Germany in hidden ships that were marked with, I think, Panamanian colors so that they wouldn't be recognized. And I unpack the full history of that in chapter 3 of the book. And I mean, it really is appalling what happened there. But once you realize that what this was fundamentally an attempt by the most powerful people on the planet, probably at that time, to create a social system of total control, because that's what they want. They have all the power. It's impossible for the masses to rise up. Revolution is impossible. And of course, at that time, this wasn't too far after the October Revolution in Russia, which had demonstrated that revolution actually is possible. So they were worried, very worried about this. And not only did we have Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia, but we mustn't forget that in 1933, in the United States, these same powerful interests that were backing Nazi Germany and were backing Stalinist Russia tried to engineer a fascist coup in the United States. It was called the Business Plot. And it was only foiled by General Smedley Butler, who was its intended leader. And he refused to go along with this. And he later, he famously came out and said Wall Street is a racket. So very clear project at the time to respond to the crisis of capitalism by manufacturing totalitarian or fascist back then societies. Now, when you realize that those same powerful families, the same powerful corporations, the DuPonts, the Fords, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, etc., have maintained very powerful positions all the way through to the present. And when you understand that the desire, the attempt to destroy liberal democracy is almost a century old now, in that light, it shouldn't come as any surprise everything that's happened since 2020. And again, we find many of the same names behind this. In particular, of course, the Rockefellers, who have been behind the digital ID, had all kinds of things to say about the vaccine rollout, etc. So in terms of the title of the book, Wall Street is kind of shorthand really for the most powerful agglomeration of interests in Western capitalist society. I mean, it's not just limited to Wall Street. Obviously, the City of London comes in, and there are kind of various connections to other countries. But the power center, particularly since 1945, has been on Wall Street in the US. And then the crimes of the deep state. This power structure was responsible for the formation of the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, which later became the CIA. It was responsible for the birth of NATO, which was later responsible for Operation Gladio and forced flag terrorism all across Europe. And then that morphed into the War on Terror. And so you can trace these things right through the 20th century. The crimes of the deep state. I have a chapter called Intelligence Crime. And it's almost Chomsky-like in its cataloguing of the crimes of US foreign policy. So on the one hand, the population is told that the propaganda is that the United States is is the beacon of democracy. It goes around the world helping to spread democracy everywhere it goes. It's all love and light. But the reality is absolutely brutal and barbaric. And everywhere it goes, generating coup after coup after coup, invading other countries, committing the most heinous crimes. Think about Nicaragua and the sponsorship of the Contras. You think about the coup in Chile. I mentioned Operation Phoenix before, the role in Indonesia in 1965. I mean, the list is endless. It just goes on and on and on, and that's before you get to Afghanistan and Iraq and so on, and Libya in the 21st century. So when you actually understand your history and the history of US foreign policy, it's clearly a history of brutal imperialism. masked by propaganda. And that then takes you forward into the present. So, what are these people willing to do in order to consolidate their own interests and their own power? Pretty much anything, actually. You can't put anything past them. They do not operate according to any normal kind of moral framework. And that gets us to where we are today.
Mm. In all that, David, what was well, you mentioned 9/11 before, and there'll be a lot of people out there that'll be interested to hear your views on what the catalyst for that was, and how you think it was orchestrated.
Well, I mean, 9/11, first of all, you can zoom back from the event itself and look at what it led to, which essentially has been a millennium of fear, and a series of false flag terrorist attacks, which have been used to replace democracy in any meaningful sense with a new paradigm of governance, which is governance by emergency. And so it's constantly lurching from crisis to crisis, be it terrorism, the financial crisis, the so-called pandemic. In every case, it's, oh my God, we're faced with this sudden emergency. We have to act now. We have to tear up the normal rules of democracy and the rule of law, etc. We just have to do these things. We have to bail out the banks. We have to shut down half the global economy in 2020. We have to go to war against Afghanistan and then Iraq. And the population kind of shocked and traumatized and still trusting in its institutions just blindly goes along with this.
Mm.
But again, there's no democracy there. And so the event itself was clearly used as the beginning of a long process of hollowing out democracy and finding deceptive pretexts for not only imperialist aggressions abroad, but increasingly oppressive measures at home. For example, through the facial recognition, the CCTV originally. I mean, Britain has the highest number of CCTV cameras per head of population of any country in the world. Blair was back then. Tony Blair was trying to push an ID card on the population. It was rejected, and now he's back for more with the digital ID. If you actually believe in their manufactured crises, then you might be willing to go along with these measures, which are increasingly repressive social control measures. Once you see through the deceptions and the manufactured crises and the false flag terrorism, etc., you can see what they're up to, and you strongly reject this. In terms of how it was pulled off, well, I mean, multiple actors must have been involved. And again, coming back to the military component, it's not plausible, is it, that the US military would stand down its air defenses for 45 minutes after the Twin Towers had been hit, allowing planes to fly all over some of the most heavily defended airspace supposedly in the world and crash into the Pentagon. I mean, that's not a credible story. And all of the war games that were happening on the day, which took many of the planes over to Alaska and Canada, far away from the event, multiple war games simultaneously. That's not an accident, is it? So then you're starting to implicate, the FAA and NORAD. When the towers went down, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, said that the air was safe to breathe. The role of Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld looks highly, highly suspicious. And I mean, this is just scratching the surface, really. And then when you look at how the towers were destroyed, I mean, it's a whole rabbit hole that we don't really have time to get into here. But my opinion is that classified military technology was used to destroy the Twin Towers, which again, it's implementing not just the military, but the deep state and the use of classified technology against the public. So when you understand what that event really was and what it was all about, you can see this deep state structure already back then going to war against, well, the US population at that time, but everybody in terms of the psychological assault, willing to kill 3,000 innocent people to achieve its aims, which is actually consistent with the strategy of tension in Italy and the false flag terrorism of the 1970s and 1980s. There was a guy called Vincenzo Vinci Guerra who was convicted for those crimes, and he later told the court that the whole point is that you have to kill innocent civilians randomly. because it's only then that the population will say, oh my God, we're faced with such a serious threat that we have to give more power to the state, more power to the security services, etc., without understanding that it's this deep state structure, NATO in that case, that was ultimately behind it. So yeah, once you see it like this, you realise that 9/11 and COVID were not separate, and that actually, COVID in some ways was a fulfillment of 9/11, perhaps, or certainly a logical extension of it. And similar modus operandi in both cases in terms of the psychological warfare, this massive shock and awe event. The populations are shocked, traumatized, shaken up, told what they must do, and the solutions proposed in both cases are oppressive and tending in the direction of authoritarianism, if not totalitarianism.
It's 1984, isn't it? I mean, it's just frightening. It's frightening to contemplate, and so much more about this stuff to unpack. Joseph Goebbels was seen as the father of propaganda, Nazi operative Joseph Goebbels. And one of the strategies he identified was put a mantelpiece radio in every home in Germany so that they could sit there every night at 6 o'clock while they're having their dinner and listen to the propaganda. Those radios have become collector's items now amongst people who collect wartime memorabilia. So propaganda now is so blatant amongst mainstream media that you cannot deny it, can you? I mean, the way they all run with the narrative, you look at 100 different news broadcasts on any given day, they're using the same script. Remember, what were some of the words they used around COVID? Well, apart from safe and effective, this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. How many times did we hear that in the 24-hour period? All the world leaders were parroting the same lines over and over again. How significant do you see the world mainstream media in this game at the moment?
It's absolutely essential. Without it, none of this could have flown. I mean, to come back to the war on terror, can you imagine a world in which the mainstream media just didn't bother reporting on terrorist attacks? So yeah, maybe some dreadful event happens and a few dozen people are killed. If the media didn't report on it, the public would remain unaware. It would get no traction. The terrorists, to the extent that they are genuine terrorists, would say, "Oh, we can't possibly fulfill any political objectives here." Because bear in mind that terrorism is always designed to achieve a certain objective. It's not just crazy and irrational and the product of madmen, etc. There's always some kind of rationale, no matter how perverted. Without the media, terrorism couldn't achieve its objectives. But instead, we found the opposite. The mainstream media, day after day, year after year, drumming in the same messages: terror, terror, fear, fear, Osama bin Laden, 9/11, the towers, over and over and over. And again, this goes deep into the psyche of the population, and that becomes their automatic frame of reference. And so, in terms of the psychological programming, in large measure, it can't be done without the media. Now, in terms of Nazi Germany, one of the interesting things that happened was a kind of centralization of media outlets under the Nazis. And Goebbels actually complained at one point. He said, look, we at least need to create the illusion that the different newspapers are, to some extent independent, and they're not just rewriting the same parroted script that they've been given. This was happening in Nazi Germany, and we have the same thing again today, because really, all of the key information in the mainstream media comes from the same handful of syndicated sources, like AP, for example, and Reuters. It's all coming down from there, and the same stories are just being rewritten in different ways by different journalists. The Just structurally, particularly in the United States, even though apparently there are hundreds, if not thousands, of independent media companies, they're all under the umbrella of 5 or 6 mega corporations. So just structurally, in terms of the ownership. So again, there, it doesn't take a wild leap of the imagination to imagine the CEOs of those 5 or 6 mega corporations and their lackeys sitting around in a room saying, right, what do we need the population to believe today? X, Y, and Z. As Mika Brzezinski, the daughter of Zbigniew Brzezinski, actually said on air, it's our job to tell the people what to think. She actually admitted it on air. It's not objectively to report the truth or to go out on kind of brave fact-finding investigative journalism missions. Fundamentally, it's to tell the people what to think. So, yeah, propaganda, absolutely fundamental. In the Nazi day, the people's receiver, as it was called, the radio that you referred to, that Goebbels wanted to see in everybody's home, that was a key instrument back then. Today, increasingly, it's more varied, but we have not just the mainstream channels, but social media as well now, increasingly being used for these purposes in ever more sophisticated ways. They found ever more cunning ways of packaging this, and the actual platforms themselves have ways of manipulating opinion, be it through manipulating news feeds. The algorithms determine what it is that you see, hence the problem of filter bubbles and so on, where people think that they know what's going on in the world. They think they know what reality is. And in actual fact, it's been carefully curated for them. So without the propaganda, none of this would fly.
Well, I can guarantee you that these couple of interviews we're doing with you will be chopped up like there's nobody's business with Facebook and some of the other major platforms. We've put together some amazing interviews and they've just chopped it up with all kinds of shadow banning, and they just don't want it to get out there. They're playing a really hard game. Johnny.
I was just going to ask in relation to you're an academic, and we quite often hear in relation to the data and what people are seeing that it's not peer reviewed. People put out documents. Do you think that this has been a 50-year marketing plan? We've had these vaccines, these childhood vaccines that we found out only recently that they've never really been tested to a standard. So the data is likely all flawed. And here we are. Was it like the perfect storm, leading people into this one event?
You do have to wonder about the history of vaccines. This is not my specialist area, but I have looked into it as a result of everything that's happened since 2020. And I'm very, very skeptical of vaccines now. I'd never really thought about it before, but the more I've learned, the more horrendous it would appear. And so if you look at the is it Humphreys and Lester book? That has a whole raft of information about the history of vaccines and were they actually was it the vaccines that saw a reduction in various diseases, or was it something else like better sanitation and so on?
Exactly.
And in case after case after case, it would appear that the rate of disease had already fallen very, very substantially before the vaccines were rolled out. The immunity given to the major vaccine manufacturers, of course, since 1986 in the US is highly, highly suspicious. Why would that be? Why is it that you're not allowed to question vaccines? This has been the case for a long, long time. You can go all the way back to 1952 and look at the writings of Bertrand Russell, and he's talking again about social control projects. And he used this extraordinary phrase. He said something like, through diet, injections, and injunctions, we'll be able to condition the population to an extent that renders revolution impossible. It's an amazing thing. And I looked at that and I thought, in 1952, you're talking about injections. Wow. So you have to then start looking at it and thinking, and plus there's all the data about, do they actually work? There's the extremely disturbing correlation between the number of childhood injections given in the US in particular and the escalating rates of autism. So do they work? Are they actually harmful? do they serve a purpose which is very different from what we thought? Are they designed to, for example, for insurance purposes, make sure people don't live past a certain age? Are they designed to create disease rather than cure, so that the population is always kind of sick? And again, you look at the rise of allergies and so on. I know that Latipova has made some observations regarding this and linking them to vaccines. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. But the whole picture that emerges to me is that the whole history of vaccination seems deeply suspect. And in my work, what I do is I pull away from a public health paradigm and I look at things from a military perspective primarily. And you have to wonder then, if vaccines are not necessarily what they have always been advertised to be, and they have an alternative purpose, well, what could that be? And it gets extremely disturbing when we get to the so-called COVID vaccines, which are not vaccines actually. They don't meet the traditional definition of a vaccine. They don't confer immunity at all. They waned in efficacy. Um, but the problem is what I mentioned in the first part of this interview. What's actually in these things? And I get into this in chapter 8 of my COVID book. That when you look, I mean, for a start, this is a whole new type of technology. The so-called mRNA technology, which was the predominant type of the COVID shot. This is something new. We're not dealing with vaccines in the traditional sense. If you trace the history of Moderna, for example, a very, very strange company that had never made anything that was marketable or profitable, was massively in debt, and yet at the start was given the kind of magical billion-dollar unicorn valuation, was being promoted by the World Economic Forum and others. What's all that about? And then magically, of course, what would you know? The Moderna vaccine was one of the major ones used. It becomes tremendously profitable. But what's actually in these things? And does it even have anything to do with mRNA? We can't be sure, because we can't trust anything that we're told. And when you look at the primary empirical evidence, which is what people like David Nixon and others have been finding under the microscope, that's what troubles me. And one of the other things I've done in my work is to go into transhumanism and the internet of bio nano things. And there's actually a large academic literature going back to 2015 on the internet of bio nano things. And what that is using intracorporeal nanotechnologies, syringe injectable, to be able to connect human beings to an external network. Now, we're really getting into some dystopian stuff here. Now, this is being sold as a great breakthrough in medical and healthcare. And, already, for example, my stepdad has a pacemaker, and it's linked to an external network. And that's a good thing in case there's a problem. Signal gets sent straight to the hospital. Brilliant. However, what if it's possible through a syringe to inject technology into people, which actually connects them to an inescapable network of wireless signals? And of course, we're seeing the masts going up everywhere. We're seeing Starlink and other similar projects that is making the internet inescapable. We're bathed in this stuff. And this, for me, is the real concern, because it all comes back to the classified military technology. I think that classified military technology was used on 9/11. I think that classified military technology is in the shots based on the evidence. We don't know what it is. And of course, if it's working at the nano scale, conventional microscopes aren't powerful enough to pick it up. None of our major institutions are actually willing to do a proper investigation on this, because all of the mainstream institutions are captured. So, you won't find universities or pharma organizations or anything like this doing the necessary work. It falls to independent investigators. But I wrote a paper as early as 2022 summarizing the findings of, how many was it? 26 different research teams from all across the world, 4 different continents, I think it was, 15 different countries, all looking at the contents of the vials themselves. And the findings were absolutely alarming. The kind of things that they were discovering, elements in there which would, have kind of strange geometric shapes, and were EMF responsive. Some of them would light up. when an EMF signal was nearby. Some of them would kind of work their way across the slide seemingly autonomously. Some of them would form structures. We appear to have kind of ribbons, even things that appear like chips. I mean, what on earth is this? Now, the skeptics say, "Oh, it's just, it's salt crystals, it's cholesterol, and this kind of thing." Well, no, I'm afraid those
Alex.
naturally occurring things don't behave like this. And these questions have not been answered yet. We still don't know what this stuff is, and you have to bear in mind, for a fact, many people, this was shown at the time, who received these injections, the site of the injection on the arm became magnetic. Now, I don't know if they're still magnetic, but at the time it was shown in case after case, on video after video.
Yep.
Why on earth would that happen from a vaccine? So, what is going on with all of this? I don't trust any of it.
David Hughes, are you a family man?
Yes, I am. Yeah,
You've got children?
I do. Yes.
What are you doing to condition the family? What are you doing to support your lifestyle into the future in a way that you are future proofing yourself as much as possible? In other words, what
Yeah.
solutions are you leaning into?
Well, minimizing exposure to propaganda is a key thing. You've got to be so careful what children in particular are exposed to. I have a 6-year-old, a 10-year-old, and an 18-year-old. And when you look at the content of what they are watching, sometimes you've really got to be very careful about which children's television even you allow them to be exposed to. Um, Devices as well. I mentioned the film I was in, the agenda. One of the other speakers there, Aman Jabi, talks about the way smart devices are being used to harvest data from children and monitor children. This is really frightening stuff. So again, minimizing exposure to these devices. Food, local farm shops, and so on, trying to get away from the major retail chains, supporting local businesses. I mean, there's all kind of things that can be done in your local area, your local community. But it is a big challenge because I'm just a regular guy, really. And again, what am I supposed to do if they turn off the internet, turn off the water, smash the global supply chains, create artificial shortages of things? I don't really have the facilities to be kind of prepping and stockpiling loads of stuff. I'm just playing my part by trying to spread this information and doing as best as I can. But I certainly recognize my vulnerability, just as many people are vulnerable. Sometimes I hear people say, "Well, what you need to do is buy gold, buy gold," and I think, what good's
What
that going to do
difference?
me? You
Yeah.
know? And it tends to be quite rich people who say these kind of things. Here's where you should be putting your investments and so on. I'm like, well, fine, but for the regular person, um, you know, the situation's been manufactured in such a way that because societies and economies are so interconnected in so many ways, they become vulnerable, actually, and particularly because everything is online. It becomes easier and easier to manufacture these crises. And so if it happens, it's difficult. I do what I can, but there are limitations.
Mm, mm. What's happening in the UK in terms of community? In Australia, there's groups here like there's the Hoodie's Heroes, which is named after Hoodie, uh, where groups are interconnecting, and they're sharing vegetables and they're helping one another and doing things like that. I mean, I've watched the movie Bank of Dave, which was a great film and story about a guy in the UK that started his own bank. Is that sense of going back to basics over there and connecting?
I don't know. I mean, again, you meet people in your local community, But how widespread this is, how I can't say really what's happening kind of beyond my local community. We had the Stand in the Park initiative, of course, during COVID, and some of that still persists. So, in case, did you have that in Australia?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that was quite valuable. Um, but unfortunately, I get the sense that most people are still largely living their lives online. And it's those kind of in-person, real connections, which are needed, I think, in the event of a major crisis. Where are you going to get your food and water from, for example? Have you formed those connections? It's incredible that we have to be talking and thinking in these terms. And again, it is kind of wartime stuff, isn't it?
It
Because
is,
we're
yeah.
talking kind of, basic survival mechanisms, and more people seem to be thinking along these lines. There is this sense that something big is coming. And in some ways, this is how they work, isn't it? It is through these kind of major events like 9/11, like COVID. When they need to go for the next big thing, they pull a lever. And unfortunately, it's just been escalating and escalating in terms of the size of it. I mean, 9/11 seemed big, had these transnational effects, but nothing compared to COVID. And so you got to wonder what's next. And again, why I am so worried, and again I come back to that chapter 7 of the book, where it leads. If we are dealing with a totalitarian mindset, well, the Nazis were perfectly willing to let 10 million Russians starve to death in order to make sure that there was enough food for the Nazi military lines as they advanced east. So, if that's the history, if we know that totalitarians are willing to let 10 million people starve to death, and we're talking about potential supply chain problems and potential food and water shortages and so on. Again, would I put it past these people to do something like this? Certainly not. And again, the mass trauma and dependency that would create, the panic, the rush to accept solutions that have been prepared by the perpetrators. This is really dark stuff. And again, to come back to the Prince of Darkness here, who seems to be presiding over all of this. I think you're right, Graham. I think you're right.
So would you see faith as an important component of the way we should be living now?
Well, personally, yeah. I mean, I couldn't do this work without it. And I remember, I think it was back in, when was this? Probably about September 2020, just faced with the enormity of it all and just thinking, God, what can I do? You know, um, and that was the first time that I came across the passage in Ephesians about putting on the armor of God. And that spoke to me so powerfully at the time because I instantly understood that actually there's nothing I can do just by myself. You have to be aligning yourself with God, however you conceive of God. Um, and that to me seems fundamental. And again, everything has been about an attack, particularly on Christianity. I mean, one simple example was the diabolical Paris Olympics propaganda there, which was just as in your face subversion of Christianity as you could hope to see. Or, of course, so many of the major kind of music events and artists, just overt satanic symbolism everywhere. Um, why would they be doing this if they didn't want to subvert, attack, destroy Christianity? So again, that religious dimension of it is just as strong, if not more powerful, than any other dimension of the Omni War. And I mean, ultimately, that I think is essential to their aims.
There's a piece of scripture that really gives me great hope, and it's in Matthew 5. I think it's Matthew 5:5. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Somebody I was doing a Bible study with before I baptized them, I was talking about the Beatitudes, and they said to me, "What's meek?" And I said, "Well, the opposite to meek is narcissism. A meek person doesn't seek to control the outcome of others. A meek person is supportive and assertive, but not aggressive and submissive." And all of a sudden it hit me. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Those globalists who are seeking to control the earth, they're narcissists, they're psychopaths. Jesus told us 2,000 years ago that they're going to lose. And I think we can draw great comfort from that. I know I do. I really do. So, as I say, I don't have to push this hard to anybody. There are so many people approaching me and others wanting to know about Jesus. And I think that's a good sign. That's one way through this. We've got to fight this based on in the light of truth. We've got to be standing in the light of truth. And I think now is the time. There's never been a better time to come to Jesus. And which I have one last question. I'll throw you one, last one too, John. It's pretty clear to see that the papacy have a very clear agenda in the New World Order. How do you see that playing out?
I have a section on the Vatican in Wall Street, the Nazis and the crimes of the deep state.
I thought you might.
Yeah, I mean, for a start, Hitler signed the Concordat with the Vatican in 1933, and so the two were fundamentally on the same page. I think the deal was something like, you don't interfere with our politics and we won't interfere with your religion. But certainly no opposition to the Nazis. In fact, quite the opposite in terms of banking and Nazi gold, including the gold that was looted from the mouths of Jewish victims. A lot of that gold went through Swiss banks, and it would appear into the Vatican Bank. And of course, the Vatican enjoys sovereign immunity. There's an interesting book by, I think, Paul Williams on Operation Gladio, which again draws attention to the role of the Vatican and its sovereign status, its diplomatic immunity, and links funding arrangements there as well in terms of Operation Gladio. So, unfortunately, the Vatican has a very dark and troubling history when it comes to these issues. And, that's before you get onto any of the kind of institutional corruption that people so often talk about. But for my purposes, I can tie it with evidence specifically to these deep state arrangements.
Johnny.
Well, I think I'll just give you an opportunity to plug your book, David, and I think it'd be great to actually get you back on, maybe in February, perhaps, and go through your 22,000 words, maybe in a PowerPoint. We did something similar with one of the WHO whistleblowers earlier this year, which was fantastic, and everyone loved it. So I think that would be a really good opportunity.
Astrid Stuckelberger.
Zuckerberg, yeah.
Yeah. And Naomi Wolf as well did the same thing on our show. Yeah, we'd love to have you back on. So can you hold your books up there for us all to have a look at?
Okay. So
give yourself a shameless plug.
All right. So the first one is COVID-19 Psychological Operations and the War for Technocracy, published with Paul Grave Macmillan in April 2024. You can find it on Amazon and other retailers. Originally, it was quite expensive. It was over £100 in the UK. I think it's down to about £50 or £60 now. The reason for the expensive pricing is that's just the way it works with academic texts. It's not a regular book. It's been triple peer reviewed. It's been published with a respected academic publisher, and generally it's academic texts are bought by university libraries on a subscription model. They're not normally for individuals to buy, hence the price. However, the good news is I was able to get open access funding for this book. Someone was very generous and was willing to pay about £13,000 to make this openly available to everyone. And so you can download it for free. If you go either to the publisher's website, which is Springer Nature, and search for the title, you can find the whole thing as downloadable PDFs. Or you can go to my Substack, dhughes.substack.com, click on the books tab at the top, and you can get the whole thing for free there as well. If you do that, if you find something of value, the one caveat I would make is that 3 years of careful research went into that book. It is chock full of credible academic sources. The reference list alone comprises about a third of the book at the end of each chapter. A lot of work, and not just intellectual effort, but emotional effort, because dealing with these topics is emotionally draining. It's very hard. So if you do download a copy, if you do find something of value, please do consider giving something back. I did leave my academic career as a result of my disillusionment with the profession over everything that's happened since 2020. So I'm now entirely reliant on public support, actually, so to keep doing the work that I am doing. So perhaps consider taking out a paid subscription to my Substack, for example, dhughes.substack.com. I set up a Buy Me a Coffee page, buymeacoffee.com/DA Hughes, specifically for the book. Or there's other support options at davidahughes.net/support. So that is the COVID book. The other one appeared 2 months later with Skyhorse, Wall Street, the Nazis, and the Crimes of the Deep State. I am happy to report that this is considerably cheaper. I think it's about £20 in the UK, something like that. And I do get, I don't know, about 5% royalties or something. Not a lot. I had my recent royalty statement come through yesterday, and I get the princely total of $230 for 6 months worth of sales. So I get a tiny amount from that book, but again, completely disproportionate to the effort that's gone into it or the significance of the book. But that should be available to you again through all the major retailers.
Well, we're having on next week, I think, Trevor Loudon, who's a Kiwi author who lives in New York City. He wrote a book called Comrade Prime Minister about our illustrious Anthony Albanese. He also did a documentary with a prominent Baptist pastor in the States called The Enemies Within the Church, leaning very heavily on communism and Marxism and the left woke agenda. Just finally, that obviously is playing an integral part on the division which is feeding the New World Order.
Well, yeah, and it's to do principally, I think, with identity politics. This goes at least as far back as the 1970s. And so if you don't want people to be thinking in terms of class divisions, kind of vertical divisions, the ruling class and the rest of us, then you need to get people to be focusing on other types of divisions. I call these the horizontal divisions, and identity is part of this. And of course, you can go back to feminism originally, dividing things along gender. And don't get me wrong, feminism has lots of important things to say. But you mentioned wokeism, and again, one of the things we've seen since 2020 has been the acceleration, for example, of the transgender agenda. And this increasing proliferation. Originally it was LGB, and then it was LGBT, and now it's LGBTQ plus and a million other things, and it's this increasing kind of atomization, isn't it? So we all have to think in terms of me as an individual, my identity. What am I? When in actual fact, for me, this is all about class. As I said before, it's a global class war fundamentally. So the wokeism, the identity politics, it's all a gigantic distraction from the bigger picture, in my opinion.
Wow. Well, this has just been absolutely fascinating. Now, I want to say to all our viewers, we're 6 days from the implementation of the social media ban and the collection of biometric data here in Australia. Look, some people are realising that eventually they may have to go down that path to keep their pensions coming and all that sort of stuff. We urge you not to stress. We're only at the beginning of all of this at the moment. And many of us are starting to think that this system cannot be sustained and it'll probably collapse, become a dismal failure. But we can't take things for granted. So anybody who continues to want to follow Club Grubbery, if we disappear off your favourite social media platform, don't forget the website, www.clubgrubbery.com.au. Now, if you go there, you'll see all of our videos that go right back from day one. You'll also see links at the bottom to social media platforms other than Facebook and YouTube. So there's BitChute and Rumble and all of those other platforms. Please get yourself used to living without Facebook. You need to. I mean, it's a despicable organisation anyway. So we need to start conditioning ourselves. So please, it's up to you. If you want to keep following us, you may have to do that because we're not inclined to play this game. So we're going to keep broadcasting as much as we can. Get ready, get prepared, educate yourselves, and do the right thing. So, David Hughes, thank you so much. Can we get you to commit to come back on in the new year?
Yes, of course.
It's been an absolute delight. I'm so glad we heard about you and we had this connection. We'd love you to be part of the Club Grubbery stable. We've got a number of international guests who come on. So thank you so much for your candor, your courage, and your intellectual expertise. It's been absolutely brilliant.
You're most welcome, and thank you for doing what you guys are doing.
Thank you, mate. Let's have a prayer, eh? Lord Father in heaven, we stand in the light of truth because we need to stand in the light of truth, and may we always recognise that source is you. Lord, amidst the horror and the terror and the anxiety that we're facing, the perplexities of life, those of us who believe in you can still get by knowing that you are ultimately in control. You have your hand on this and you'll see it out the way it should be. So, Father in heaven, please guide and lead us and protect our families and give us the wherewithal to bring our countries back to their feet again. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Johnny Larder, you've often been heard to say,
you just couldn't make this stuff up.
You couldn't make this stuff up. Absolutely. Stay out of the trees, Australia. Don't forget what you did yesterday got you to today. Get out and enjoy this country while you can. It's a beautiful country. And hopefully you might come over with your family and we'll show you around, David. It'd be great to have you come and visit us.
That'd be awesome. I need to do a down under tour at some point.
Yeah, that'd be great. We can line you up with some great venues. Believe me, we can help you organise that. All right, Australia, thank you for watching Club Grubbery. More great interviews coming your way. Until then, bye for now.